Hello and welcome to the Aviation Briefing with me, William Hallowell. In this podcast series, I speak with media and industry guests about the biggest topics and stories in aviation. Today, I'm joined by Kevin Brundish, who is the CEO of LionVolt, a startup company trying to develop batteries for electric aircraft for commercial flying. This is quite an interesting area of aviation. There's a lot of innovation going on in the industry at the moment, particularly with regard to sustainability. We've got lots of developments in SAF, hydrogen electric flying, and even electric flights. But for commercial flying, I mean, it's quite a long way off almost, isn't it? When we think about, the future of aviation and the sustainable path it wants to take, when we think about the net zero goal for 2050. With regard to battery powered aircraft and the wide scale rollout of that for commercial flying with passengers, I mean, what are companies doing in this space at the moment to facilitate that?
Yeah, hi Will, thanks for that. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, obviously there's been a real drive in the battery world for some time actually on putting more energy into sort of the same space and the same weight. So that results in lighter batteries. And that's really what's led to automotive adopting them. And we're seeing now that other markets are also pushing that direction, and aviation is obviously just one of those. So really companies have been developing those technologies for some time. LionVolt's one of those companies. We're looking at the next generation. Really what we're trying to do is put, maybe double the energy and somewhat more than that through the technologies we're developing. And that's the sort of technology that could then open up electric flight, because today's cells probably aren't really good enough. They've been used in smaller aircraft, as you've already referenced, but they're not really right when you get to sort of large aircraft, passenger carrying aircraft. So there's a lot of development going on. LionVolt is part of that, but it's a big ecosystem. So and it's moving quite fast. I think ever since automotive has started adopting it, it's been going fast. So yeah, plenty going on there, Will.
Yeah, I mean, the aviation industry is quite fascinating in some senses because the innovation that's involved, particularly on the sustainability side. You mentioned the automotive industry. I know one GSE manufacturer that uses Nissan Leaf batteries for their ground power units, their GPUs. And, there are lots of people trying to innovate in the electric aircraft space. You've got companies like Pipistrel, which, of course, that's not commercial flying, but I suppose commercial is always going to be the central focus from the passenger perspective and the things that the mainstream media kind of focus on. But in terms of, a wide scale kind of rollout of this sort of thing, I mean, what does the industry need to do in terms of cross-industry collaboration and working with different stakeholders? What do they, as the industry encompassing, need to do to make this almost a reality? Because it seems in some senses that this could be very far off, particularly when we consider, like I say, the 2050 net zero target. What is the flight path, if you'll excuse the pun, to get to electric powered commercial aviation?
Well, so I think you'll see it adopted in phases. Generally, you've already made reference to Pipistrel. They've got a small aircraft, a piston, propeller aircraft. That's typical of what's being done at the moment. Using electric to drive the propeller is a relatively straightforward change, but the aircraft hasn't changed. So you'll note that it's really just the electrification of an aircraft that looks very much like today's flying aircraft. And, we can see that being now worked on in larger aircraft. Maybe they'll be flying, short range commercial jets over the next sort of 10, 20 years. That certainly feels possible with, an evolution of today's technology. And again, that's where we fit as LionVolt. We're looking at that next generation, and they're coming along fast. So we aren't decades away from having these types of products that could well generate a larger aircraft flying with passengers, but still shortish range. But that is a lot of flights. We know that the long haul is going to be another challenge. And there are technologies that are looking at how that might be achieved. And typically that's what's called solid state batteries. They have significantly more energy than what you can get out of today's products. So they're also being developed, and it's quite newsworthy. Large companies, small companies are working on those types of technologies. LionVolt fits into that sphere as well. So in my opinion, we're going to see the rollout. If you look at automotive, is a great example. Actually, the cars were designed originally and then looked to be electrified. But in some cases, like Tesla, they really looked at the electric system and sort of designed the car around it. And I think there's going to be an element of that happening too. Hybrid approaches were obviously also an interim stage where you start to perhaps not use as much fossil fuel. You replace some of that energy using electric sources, batteries being one of them. And there's been, demonstrators on hybrid type solutions already as well. So I could see an evolution not dissimilar necessarily to, the way automotive went. But I do think there is a bit of a sort of change that has to come around because the aircraft might need to look quite different. And it probably isn't going to just look like a standard aircraft with the engine now powered by a battery. There are other electrical solutions, of course, like hydrogen through either combustion or through fuel cells. So there's quite a lot of different technologies that can be used. Unlikely that one of them will be in isolation. It will likely be a combination. I think there'll always be a space for batteries. And the fast pace and fast moving of the development that's now occurring, I think will be, of value to electric aviation.
It is interesting. I mean, you mentioned hybrid. One kind of case study I wanted to highlight was EcoJet in the UK. The entrepreneur Vince Dale has obviously launched this airline, and he's hoping to begin operations this year, just in the UK. But the idea, I think, behind it is he wants it to be, in quotation marks, the green flag carrier for Britain. Obviously, he's working with Zero Avia, who are trying to develop hydrogen electric engines. But again, I suppose it goes back to that cross-industry collaboration. But what actually would that collaboration entail? Because that is a word, it's almost a buzzword in the aviation industry. As someone covering it, I go to a lot of conferences and a lot of stakeholders and C-suite executives. They use that word quite a lot, without perhaps much substance in some cases. So, I mean, what does the industry have to do to really ensure that this could be a possibility in the future, perhaps, as you say, not necessarily decades and decades away?
Yeah. Well, I think what you'll see is a little bit like what we saw in automotive as well. So if you look at the traditional manufacturers, the traditional vehicle OEMs, they weren't the innovators in this space. They did a lot of work on it, but they really didn't push the innovation. And then you had effectively a startup in something like Tesla and the predecessors of Tesla. They really started to drive the industry. And I think you're seeing that now in aviation too. You mentioned EcoJets, but there are other companies, and we're working with some around Europe that are also looking at quite a different design on the aircraft that then allows electric, flight with perhaps not as much advancement in the technology as you might think. So this might be just the next generation rather than 2 or 3 or 4 generations away. So I think we'll see some of that innovation come from these smaller companies that are thinking new, and are starting from fresh, if you want to look at it that way. But of course, Boeing, Airbus, Rolls-Royce, big industry players are doing a lot of work in that space as well. And so I think we will see a lot. And they've all flown electric aircraft at some stage or another, and hybrid aircraft. So the technology is not, it is available. What it can do, how commercial it is, I guess, is something that we have to look at. I think it goes hand in hand with, again, not just the industry, but government. So if you look at automotive again as an example, tailpipe emission ban was really a step change in the way that the vehicle manufacturers looked to go, and now they have to have an electric solution. There isn't really an alternative. And at the moment, although there are obviously emissions legislation in place for aviation, there isn't quite that that stark change legislated for at the moment. So I do think there's going to be a step change, but we all know it has to be commercially possible. There's no point in putting targets on an industry that just can't be achieved. Short haul is more likely to happen first, and then you have a nice mix of fleet. That happened in automotives as well. They first set fleet targets, so that could be something that comes in. So I do think it's going to have to be not only industry, government. I think the innovation will come not only from the big companies, but from startups like ours.
So you mentioned government help there. That's, especially in an innovative area like sustainable aviation. I speak to a lot of people who say it is vital for governments to play their role in this. We're currently recording this on the day of the UK general election. From your view, what would the next government, whomever they are, what role will they have to play, taking the UK as an example, in facilitating this? Is it about funding? Is it about incentives? I want to move on to things like sustainable aviation fuel shortly, but they've got things like the emissions trading schemes, and they're introducing mandates for that. What would government-backed innovation look like in the UK, for instance?
Yeah, well, the government already backs a lot of innovation, as I'm sure you're aware. It partly funds a whole battery program that is a bit automotive focused, but actually links up with aerospace institutions in particular, like the ATI in here in the UK. So there is an awful lot of money that is spent on innovation. Actually, that's where I think UK government is strong. But it always has to be coupled with a driver that will sort of push the industry in that direction. So, for me, and I haven't voted yet, I've got to do that. But for me, the incoming government has got to take a long look at exactly how it incentivizes. There's no point in putting targets that can't be reached without some incentivization behind it. But it's got to look at incentivizing other industries, aviation being a key one, I think, to drive down that pathway, because of course it will then accelerate that innovation and that need. And I think when that happens, we will start to see an even greater evolution and a greater opportunity, because the technology is moving forwards. And I truly believe that some of the short haul aircraft can become fully electric, and that's passenger, not just sort of pleasure flights and things like that. Some decent seat carrying, 50 plus would be where I would see the next step. But it isn't going to be simple, and there does need to be a bit of a shift in how that works. Will it be as cheap, as efficient? It's hard to say because it's still quite early days. But yeah, I think the government's got to take a long, hard look at the legislation and make sure that the way that drives. I think aviation is a bit unusual as well, because you can't really look at it entirely nationally. It's a truly international, but particularly when you get up even to short haul, yes, there are domestic flights, but the vast majority of flights, from the UK, and they are not landing in the UK. So it's a truly international drive, and there are international bodies looking at this. So, but it has to be a real push from that whole community, and then the innovation, I think, will mature, and we will start to see some of those short haul, electric flights become a reality.
Looking ahead, then, you mentioned just there that it's not necessarily a national effort, but an international effort. The global aviation industry has this 2050 net zero goal. A lot of people say that sustainable aviation fuel is going to play a huge part in that, in the decarbonisation of flight. A lot of other people say SAF is only one solution. Talking about the timescale for, you mentioned that short haul is going to come much sooner in terms of fully battery powered flight compared to, say, long haul. We're talking perhaps an A320 compared to, an Airbus A380, that sort of thing. What role will fully electric flight play in decarbonisation? And in the future, I'm going to try and pick your brains on this. Is the future of flight perhaps going to be entirely electric one day? What's your kind of prediction on that?
Yeah, so I've already mentioned phases, and I think even short haul A320, yes, that's a large seat aircraft. I think we're going to see firstly the propeller aircraft community, where lower seat capacity and relatively short haul, so the sort of 500 to 1,000 kilometer sort of range, and a sort of 50 to 70 type seat passenger. I think those are a more realistic target for the near to midterm, with the way I see battery technology going, and with with companies like LionVolt what they can achieve in that sort of time frame. When you get to the sort of large aircraft, and even a 320 is going to be, much more difficult than that, and a 380 more difficult still. There has to be some real step changes in the technology. You're probably looking at needing something like 4 times the energy that a current cell has today. Now, do we know of solutions that can provide that, even if they've not been commercialized? Well, we do. Can they be commercialized? Well, the potential is there, of course. Have they been commercialized? No. So, that's the journey we're on. I think there are, clear maps for what is possible, and lots of companies are working on both near term and mid term, and of course long term improvements in batteries in particular. But again, I think it will be a very blended approach to start with. And will we see all electric flight? Well, I hope so. I'd certainly like to see that. But I do know that large long haul aircraft are going to be a very big challenge to, be entirely, electric. Maybe with the introduction of something like hydrogen and a battery, maybe that's possible. But that's going to be the hardest part to achieve.
I suppose it comes down to, airlines and their willingness to engage as well, and whether, they see a viability now, they see a business case for it now, because, I've had someone on here from Loganair before, and they're doing a lot of work in the hydrogen electric powered space. And like you mentioned, they operate a lot of ATRs because they're only, again, they're a regional UK airline. And again, you mentioned Rolls-Royce, who are part of the hydrogen and aviation group, along with EasyJet and a number of other stakeholders. So I suppose it is very interesting. And one point that someone made to me before was that it's always going to be those smaller carriers that are going to have to focus on things like electric and hydrogen and all these different alternative fuels for commercial aircraft, because the main way to decarbonize through SAF is going to have to be through those longer flights, right? Yeah. So perhaps the innovation, or at least the pushing of these technologies and making them more, mainstream, I suppose, is going to have to come from those smaller carriers who are doing smaller operations. Perhaps they're regional as opposed to international.
Yeah, and look, I think there's 2 good things about that. One is that's a good match of where the technology in the near term presents itself. So it does, lend itself to a sort of, propeller type aircraft rather than a large turbofan. It does present itself to the sort of smaller seat capacity than the large seat capacity. And SAF, of course, is much more advantage when it's used in the longer haul higher seat capacity. So actually, if we look at it from that perspective, it's a nice blend. I think I've said a number of times it's that sort of direction that we'll take, but it does need, even today's cells are going to struggle to get that community flying electric. So it does need the next generation to mature. It does need companies like LionVolt to get their technology, into a commercial position, which we obviously intend to do in the coming years. It needs partnerships, people that also have that vision that electric flight can be realized, and we're working with a number of those groups. And then it needs the end users, the airlines, to also share that. But I think there's always a helping hand if government legislation also plays a part in that and drives the industry in that direction. Cost effectiveness for the first time you do it is always challenging, and that's where some of the incentives and support will come in, and of course the drive to do it could also come from a sort of a legislative direction where carrying on just isn't going to be allowed. So I think there will be a whole combination needed before that will be realized. But the technology is certainly developing at pace, and the potential is there.
Do you think almost that the technology is developing faster than almost the industry can keep up? I mean, to draw one comparison, I cover a lot of things to do with airside operations and the electrification of ground support equipment and all these sorts of things. And it seems that the OEMs, the original equipment manufacturers, are always ahead almost of not even just the ground handlers who want to adopt electric, but even the airports, because the infrastructure isn't there. So, I mean, what's your take on that?
No, I mean, again, you've hit on a really good thing. I mean, the electrification of aviation isn't just the aircraft. You've already seen a lot of electrification at the airports, and anyone's been to Heathrow will have been on the pod, right? The parking, and then you get on the electric vehicle that takes you there. So sort of ground transportation, it's all being done already. So there's a lot of electrification already happening. The aircraft is probably the slower part on that, but you're right. The willingness to adopt, it's always a difficult argument to try and do the first, and that's because the economics rarely work without the scale. And so if you're doing it in small scale, then the economics are harder to make work. So you have to have the incentives behind it from government, and you have to have the willingness of the industry to really start investing in that to get it up and running. I think we are seeing that. There is a lot of work happening in aviation, not just on the ground, but in the aircraft itself. So I'm confident that we're going to go in the right direction, and we will see electric flight in the sort of way I've described.
Well, look, Kevin, thank you very much for taking some time to speak to me this afternoon. It's been genuinely really fascinating to get your views on a few of these really important topics as the industry continues to decarbonize.
Thanks.